Hi, I am Lobna Hassan. I am a postdoctoral researcher doing research on a lot of technology related topics. I come from a business background, and as of I think it was what month is it? Yeah, as of October 2020, I was asked to prepare and deliver a recorded lecture on the effect of the pandemic, the COVID-19 thing that we're living right now, on a few industries. And so the video that you're about to watch now is the recording of that lecture. This lecture was intended to be more speculative and sort of, at least it was intended for undergraduate students as a way to highlight to them that as much as businesses have power in shaping our economy and in affecting our demand and our preferences, that we also as consumers hold this power, and that the pandemic was a case where demand had a huge influence on businesses and on how businesses responded by changing their strategies to cope with this new change. I am running a bit in circles right now, and so this is my cue to end this introduction and to leave you with the recorded lecture. Hello and welcome to this online lecture. I hope that everything is going well with you and your family and your loved ones. I will start sharing my screen now so that everyone can see the slides that I have prepared. All right, so now you should be seeing my desktop, or at least the recording should be recording my desktop. Um, so hopefully everything is recording fine and going all right. But so before I start talking about what I'm supposed to be talking about, I will introduce myself. I am Dr. Lobna Hassan. I am a postdoctoral researcher working at the Center of Excellence on Game Culture Studies at Tampere University, and I am also affiliated with Hanken School of Economics. I got my master's and bachelor's from the German University in Cairo, which I am expecting most of everyone who's listening to this lecture basically to be studying now. And then after my master's, I traveled to Finland, where I got my PhD from Hanken School of Economics. And since then, I have been doing research on a lot of topics that have to do with accessibility, gamification, games, online participation, and a lot of things. So my email is there, as well as my online website. If you want to know more about the research that I do, or if you want to contact me, feel free to drop me an email when you want to. And so with that brief introduction, what I'm here to talk to you about, your Dr. Dr. Heba has asked me to prepare this lecture for all of you on the impact of the pandemic, what we're living now, on business strategy. And so what I'm going to do today is that basically I am going to give you a few examples of how the pandemic has affected different and somehow important industries in our lives. And then we're going to end with sort of a speculation of what could happen next, or what is it that we can expect in the coming months or in the coming years. So in case you were wondering, so like I said, I got my PhD in Finland. So I was living in Finland, or I'm still living in Finland at the time when the pandemic started. I'm originally Egyptian, even if I don't look like that. But so my experience and my reflection on the pandemic is highly affected by where I was living when the pandemic started, and and also nowadays. So I would have sincerely loved if we were able to interact so that we can also compare what it was like in Egypt. However, this would not be possible. So I am also relying on what my parents have told me, and I will somehow try to a bit discuss it from the two contexts that are close to my heart. But so because of that, I wanted to give like a brief introduction to what is Finland, because if you're like me, I did not know that there was a country called Finland, unfortunately. And so if you're like me, this map might be helpful um, to know where Finland is. So Finland is this country highlighted in this, I don't know what this color is, reddish, brownish something. So Finland is this country. This is Germany that I think most of you might be familiar with. So Finland is to the north, a lot to the north. And this is, of course, Egypt is here. So it's a lot to the north. And actually, I think a quarter, I'm not sure how much, but at least a quarter or 1/3 maybe of the Finnish land is within the North Circle, the circle of the North Pole. So it's actually like really freezing cold upstairs, or like more towards the north. So I live in Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland. This is a picture of the harbor there, or like a part of the harbor. This is sort of an iconic picture because you see a few of the landmarks from that city. Finland is in general a country that is very good with gaming industries and tech industries at large, software industries. It is the country that brought you Nokia. So Nokia is actually called or named after a city in Finland, and the main headquarters are in Finland. And it is also the country that brought you Angry Birds and a lot of other games that you probably have played, but at least Angry Bird is, of course, or I expect is the most known of these games. Finland is also known for being very cold, like I said. So this is sort of where we have a lot of reindeers, where we have a lot of snow most of the year. It's up north, the sun can go down, or it does go down, and it doesn't come up again for 6 months, or I don't know how long, but for a very long time. And so it is also rumored, or the legend has it, that Santa Claus comes from Finland. So this is Santa Claus's village in Rovaniemi. It's an actual place that tourists really love and normal people live at. This is a picture from, I'm not sure which year, but it's from December some time ago. And so because of that, Finnish kids receive their Christmas gifts earlier than anyone else, because Santa has to visit them first, of course, before he goes to the other kids in the other countries around the world. And so what we're going to talk about is this. So what is all of this like now? Like, what is life like now because of the pandemic? So I hope that most of you are wearing masks like the Santa here, but it has had an effect beyond just our apparent behavior in terms of social distancing and of wearing of masks, and of maybe being worried about our health and that of our families and loved ones. It has had a profound impact on almost everything in our life. And I'm sure that you have felt it, and you don't need me to give you this introduction. But so what we're going to do today is that basically we're going to quickly walk through the timeline of how the events of the pandemic developed, because that is important for us to understand how things were affected. And then we're going to talk a lot about the current times. So the intermediate times, so which is what I call now. So now is what I refer to as intermediate times. So how are the industries that I outlined here, how are they affected because of the pandemic, and how has it changed their business strategy in order to cope? And then, like I said, we are ending with a speculative section on like what might be happening in the future and what should we expect and stuff like that. So basically, I'm sure you all know this story, so I'm gonna skip through it a bit. And then you have this timeline in more details if you want to pause and look at it in more details. But basically, it all sort of started from December 2019. So towards the end of December 2019 in China. And then in January is sort of where Wuhan was placed under lockdown. And when we started to feel that there is something bigger that is going on, that is just not just a cold that is affecting everyone, but that there is maybe something bigger. And that was also in January when the World Health Organization sort of declared an emergency state, and sort of things started to happen. More serious lockdowns started to become a thing around March. So, and that is around when the WHO declared this to be a global pandemic. And for me, that was a new word that I had to look up to understand what is a pandemic and what is this thing that they are talking about. But so, sort of, from January to February was a period where people were trying to make sense of what is going on. Is this really a disease that we should be reacting to in that way, or is it just a cold that will pass and maybe we should not do anything about it? And I don't want to get into that debate per se, but it's the thing that has led to these lockdowns wasn't the severity of the disease itself. Like, it doesn't have a very high death rate compared to other diseases. We know more deadly diseases, but the issue is that if everyone gets sick at the same time, then everyone goes to the hospitals and doctors and needs medication at the same time, and then we cannot keep pace with that. So we have overloaded hospitals, overloaded medicine factories. There isn't enough medicine even for simple things, because if suddenly, like, think about it, if suddenly everyone has a cold and everyone goes to the pharmacy and buys even Panadol and all that kind of stuff, then they will run out of Panadol. And so that was why the lockdowns and the quarantines started. Not because we're scared that people are going to die. Of course, we're scared. And it's, even if 1% dies or even 0.5%, that's a huge loss to the world. But the fear was that it would be more than 1%, that it would be a lot of people dying of things that could be treatable, but we're unable to treat them because hospital beds are full and are taken by other people in more serious conditions and so on. So while because I'm giving maybe this introduction because maybe the business effects or the economic impact of the pandemic has not been great at all. And because of that, there is a huge debate that I'm sure you have heard about, of whether this reaction was appropriate or not. It's a debate. You can take the side that you feel you want to take based on after reading the evidence online and after getting informed. But to me, at least, it seems that yes, there have been catastrophic economic impacts, but it could have been worse for humans. It could have been worse if we lost more people than we lost. And it could have been just, we sacrificed sort of the economic part and maybe our mental health part to keep our health maybe, and to keep the people that we care about and love alive, and to make sure that no one dies of any stupid, like, treatable thing just because supermarkets and pharmacies ran out of Panadol and stuff like that. So anyway, lockdowns started around March, and so the immediate impact, what I just said, people didn't even know what the word pandemic is. And so the immediate impact was panic. And I think this is something that was seen globally in all countries around the world. People just went to the supermarkets and bought everything that they could buy. And we sort of criticized this behavior online, but we have to admit that we also, to an extent, engaged in it ourselves. And it's, if you want to understand why people did this, it's not just because we're afraid that products will run out. So, for example, in Finland, people were afraid that pastas, especially, and of course toilet paper, but pastas would run out. And so a lot of people started to buy a lot of pasta, but it's not just because they are afraid that they will not find this product tomorrow. It also gives them a sense of control. Like, there is this scary thing that is happening in the world around me and I don't understand it. I don't know how to respond to it. But one way that I can feel more in control, one way that I can respond to this scary thing happening, is that I can get prepared. I can buy what I can buy. I can make sure I have what I need, and then the world is not going to affect me. I'm going to be perfect. And so this immediate response was psychologically, it was a way for people, for us to feel that we're still in control, that there is still something that we can do against this monster that we don't understand. And so immediately there was shops were wiped out. And then we have seen people who stayed at home and turned into or towards online shopping. So a lot of people buying things online, a lot of home deliveries. And home delivery was a thing. Like, we always had home deliveries in Egypt, Mac delivery and all that kind of stuff. You can get anything delivered virtually. I think, like, we even had mashawir, I think, or I don't know what's it called, that they can go and buy like a concert ticket even for you, or whatever, anything that you want. Basically, you can find someone to do it for you. Like, we have the idea of baweb even. And so all of these that sort of were new to European and Western cultures, not new per se, but hard to implement for reasons that we will get into later, they suddenly started to be more available and for people to use them more. So we've seen home deliveries a lot. It became a thing in a lot of countries where it was not a thing before the pandemic. And we also have seen that people started to try to find alternatives for their how they were living their life. So a lot of people suddenly were not able to go to the gym, they're unable to exercise. In some countries, I think in the US, in many states in the US, you cannot just go for a walk or a run without wearing a mask. And okay, so you can leave your house, but you have to wear this mask. And let's just be honest about it, the mask is not the most comfortable thing. Even if we have to wear it for the well-being of humanity, it's not the most comfortable thing. And so you cannot really run with it if this is your main form of exercise. And so we started to see people switch to other alternatives. So this is, for example, a game on the Switch called Ring Fit Adventure. And so it's a way for people to do the same thing that they were doing before the pandemic, but at home. And this was not just seen with exercise, but like even with work, was trying to, set up your home office and stuff like that. And most aspects of life. And then we've seen things that affected sort of both producers and consumers. So both service providers and businesses, but also us as individuals, which is that a lot of, especially restaurants and shops, had to close. I think this was not maybe enforced for a lot of time in Egypt, but it was a thing in Finland and in Europe for a month. And so what happens is that if you close as a restaurant, you basically have to lay off people who are working for you. So we've seen a lot of layoffs, and this was bad for both the business because their employees are not happy about it, and it's also bad for the consumers because these are people who lost their income. And so on an individual level, there was a lot of income loss and a lot of insecurity because of these closures and lockdowns. And so we also have seen businesses, for example, mostly the travel industry and the airline industry, that had to issue refunds. And we saw that with hotels. And we've seen in other side, like the other side of it, so like here we see businesses that are losing money, that are closing down, that are returning money to customers. But on the flip side of it, which we will talk about later, we see businesses that sort of were doing very well, that they cannot cope with how much demand they suddenly had. So Amazon is a prime example for that, because they were suddenly unable to keep the delivery dates that they promised. There were so many packages to be processed, so many orders to be filled. They ran out of stock. They ran out of employees, even because employees working at their warehouses also need to keep social distancing. So if a warehouse accommodated, let's say, 20 employees, they needed to make that 10 employees now, so that these 10 employees have more space to keep more social distance from each other. And so they were faced with an increased demand, but at the same time, their capacity to fulfill it decreased because of social distancing. And so overall, their capacity to do their business decreased because they are no longer able to perform at the levels that they had before. They are no longer able to deliver at the times they had promised before. And also, like, I'm not sure which country this photo comes from, but this is a person who is sanitizing the packages before they're being delivered. So this is a person working at a post office or something. And so before they deliver these packages, they need to sanitize it. So that also takes time, because even if this process takes like 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes within which they could have delivered a package or two, or I don't know how many. So overall, like, creating more steps in the order fulfillment process makes it hard to fulfill the demand. And so what I am sort of overall trying to say with these examples is that, and this is sort of a basic economic lesson that I think you might have, or you did take it in Economics 101, or at least when I was at the GUC, that's when I learned about this. And the basic lesson is that sort of in any market, we have a balance between demand and supply, right? Like, the demand curve and the supply curve. And then basically what happens is that if one of these curves changes, so if demand increases, then supply will try to produce more as well. And if demand for something decreases, then supply would try to drop down how much it produces stuff so that it doesn't have a lot of surplus, so that it doesn't lose money. And so with this idea in mind, businesses have always thought about that, okay, we can affect supply, we can affect demand very well. So let's make products, let's advertise them to people, and people will come. So, like, let's create airline trips, for example, between Cairo to Madrid or whatever, and people are going to book them if they are available, if they are within a good price, if we market them well, people are just going to buy our product. And Apple is a prime example of that. So years ago, the iPad was not a thing. Like, it was, when it was being introduced to the market, we did not exactly know that there can be something in between a computer that is sort of like a computer, but not fully, and is like as portable as a phone, but not fully. This category did not exist, and so sort of Apple created that market. They created the iPad, they marketed very well. They are like the best when it comes to marketing products and creating a need for it in consumers. And what maybe you might know or don't know is that tablets, as an idea in general, tablets were there already. Like, they were being produced by a lot of companies, but they did not kick off, and we did not see that demand for them until Apple came out with the iPad and started to market it. And it was expensive, and so consumers who couldn't afford an iPad were settling for other tablets that might be cheaper. And so the idea basically was to create customer needs. So I'm going to produce something, I'm going to market it well, and so people are going to come, are going to buy it. This is usually how businesses operate. And then, however, the truth of the matter is that consumers have a lot of power, and often we are not aware of the power that we have as a consumer. So what we have seen before with especially like fast food restaurants, because they have been used to the way of manufacturing like burgers in a certain way for a very long time. And so when people started to become vegetarian or vegan for environmental purposes, or for any purpose really, what happened was that you would have a group of friends going out, so like 5, 6, whatever people going out, but then there would be 1 or 2 vegetarians in that group. And because this group is a group of friends and they usually want everyone to be happy, they sometimes would choose restaurants that had vegetarian options just for this 1 or 2 people who were vegetarian in the group. And so what McDonald's and fast food restaurants started to observe is that people were going away from them because of this minority at that time that was vegetarian. And so they started to make vegetarian options themselves so as to get people back to their restaurants and to eat at their restaurants. So making vegetarian food was not something maybe that years ago there was a lot of demand for, but if they had not done that, then they sort of might have lost more demand or bigger demand to other suppliers. And so we see the same thing with fast fashion. So we see that H&M now is trying to make more sustainable and conscious products, and H&M is not a sustainable or a conscious label per se. It is known for being a fast fashion manufacturer, and that has been in a lot of cases of misusing labor and stuff like that. So the pandemic perhaps was one of the clear examples that made it very clear that actually demand does affect supply, that people going vegetarian affects how McDonald's makes its products, that people deciding to be more conscious about their fashion purchases affects how H&M is going to manufacture its stuff and treats its workers, that everyone being scared to travel is going to actually make travel companies need to cancel their flights and refund customers and stuff like that. So it's not exactly a new lesson that we take from the pandemic, but it sort of makes it clear that you have to pay attention to the demand part, and that this demand part has a lot of power to influence everything. So like I said, all of this is not necessarily, so yeah, the shelves being clean is maybe a problem because factories were closed because of the pandemic. So yeah, supply maybe couldn't keep up here, but it happened, like this whole thing happened because demand suddenly increased. So because demand changed its behavior. And so all of these are examples of this balance and how change in demand affects supply. And if we start to look deeper, so for example, if we start to look at the tourism industry, and basically on the accommodation part of the tourism industry. So if we start to compare how Airbnb and hotels are doing during this pandemic, we need to sort of understand how their business strategies and business practices are different. So for Airbnb, they capitalize and they make use of the fact that they can offer cheaper hotels or cheaper accommodation. They can not just cheaper, but you can even find some cabins that are sort of in a very interesting location, like in Santa Claus's village near the reindeers, and I don't know, and this cabin would be very expensive, but you would be taking it because of the experience. So it's not just that cheap prices, it's that it's a huge price range if you want to book an accommodation that is cheap, or if you want to book an accommodation that is about the experience and get like a very unique experience that might be expensive. Hotels can't necessarily do that. Yeah, there are hotels that are about the experience, but that's not the common thing. It's not like chains like Radisson Blu and Hilton and stuff like that. They are not necessarily about giving you this unique Santa Claus village experience, something. But they have other benefits, and their base benefits mainly are about the services. So about like that you have room service, that you have a desk where you can check out and check in very consistently. And so sort of they are Airbnb and hotels, they are sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum in a bit, where they sort of offer different things, maybe not at the end of the spectrum, but they sort of offer different things to their consumers. And at the start of the pandemic, like I said, everything, like most things, most travel was canceled. And so Airbnb and hotels were sort of equally affected. And they somehow at the start responded in the same way. So they had to Where is it? So yeah, so they had to issue refunds to travelers. So hotels had to cancel bookings, and Airbnb had to cancel bookings and to issue these refunds to the traveler. But the key difference now is that when a hotel cancels a booking and refunds the money, it it's a business entity in itself. So the hotel itself loses money. But when an Airbnb does that, the host, the person who owns the flat where you had booked the room, that person loses money and not Airbnb itself. So that is sort of the key difference here, that Airbnb was an intermediary, and when it canceled, when it said it was okay for customers and travelers to cancel their trips and they will get a full refund, when they did that, the people who were affected were the hosts. And so the hosts were very angry at Airbnb because they felt that they should have been consulted. They should have agreed with the company on that. They are now taking all the losses, and Airbnb is not sort of losing anything, which is not true, because the way Airbnb works is that it takes a commission from the host. So also Airbnb is losing income when it cancels these reservations. But the immediate reaction of the hosts were that you are letting us down. And that is sort of similar to the reaction that hotel employees had when they were laid off. And so in this case with Airbnb and hotels, they made a group happy, but at the same time, they made the key group that is running their business unhappy with that. And here, sort of, what they somehow these businesses tried to do to fix the situation was that Airbnb, for example, created a financial support. So if you were a host, if you had a property on Airbnb, you can apply online and they will give you some money to support you during these times. And so they were giving back to the community in that way. I don't think I've heard of hotels that did that. And so maybe there was, I'm not sure, but I think hotels just in many cases dropped their employees. I think at least some hotels might have offered compensation. But so the argument now is that Airbnb was in a better situation of being able to respond and to make its suppliers or employees, the hosts, happier than hotels were being able to do. And then now the issue of that, when things are maybe reopening a bit, or when there's hope that maybe after in the coming months there would be a vaccine, and so some travel would start to come back, we see that hotels and Airbnb are responding differently to this opening up again. So hotels are advertising this, that they are, so we see images like this, that, oh, we're disinfecting everything, we're very clean, there is nothing that you can worry about, just come and stay in our hotel. And this is actually a photo I took from one business trip I had to make, where you see here that they put hand sanitizer in all the rooms, sort of as free gift to the guests that are coming, to encourage people to come and stay at the hotel. So hotels have this capacity to do that, to advertise this cleanliness and standardization, because when you're going to a hotel, especially if it's a large chain, you're expecting this standardization, and they sort of have the staff and have the financial ability to do this. However, on the other side, Airbnb doesn't have that. Like, it cannot really force its hosts to carry out this level of cleaning to their flats. Like, this is not realistic. And they cannot ask every host to provide hand sanitizer, because in some companies, some countries, hand sanitizer is still not easily available, and it would be very expensive. So Airbnb can't do that. So they actually did something different. So it's a different strategy to respond to the same situation of that you want to attract customer back to your business. What they did is that they advertised the idea of going near, so travel locally, and things like you can book this cabin in the middle of the woods. It's actually You don't have to pay a lot for it, and it's an experience of a lifetime. Like, how many times in your life are you going to stay in the middle of the forest like this? And so they highlighted that you don't need international travel where you can be exposed to the virus, or need to do a PCR test before and after, need to get quarantined and so on. You don't need any of that. You can just go locally, and not locally to anywhere, but to somewhere that is sort of magical. And so there are different strategies between Airbnb and hotels. One emphasized their strength, which is the room service, and that they have a lot of employees and they can make things standardized. And the other also emphasized its strengths, that it can offer experiences and variety and a different range, and that you can travel locally and so on. And so in times of sort of distress, it's interesting to see that how businesses understand their strengths differently and capitalize on them differently, while at the same time trying to maintain different groups happy, like in trying to make your hosts that are offering apartments on Airbnb happy. You might make your travelers unhappy, and the other way around. And so it's always sort of a balance between these different groups. And sometime a business has to sort of take a loss in order to keep these groups happy on the long run. So Airbnb needed to somehow issue financial support for its hosts, because if these people are unhappy, they're going to pull their apartments from Airbnb, and this is not good on the long term after the pandemic is over. Like, Airbnb cannot have this animosity. Um, Same goes for hotels and hotels employees, but maybe it's easier to sort of find new employees than it is to find new hosts. If we go to restaurants, and I think for time purposes, I'm gonna pass through these quickly, or at least quicker than I have been. So for restaurants, we have seen that they sort of, depending on the country, they had to close. And so as a way to survive, a lot of these restaurants started to rely on delivery apps. So the restaurant part itself, where the tables and all that stuff can be closed, but the kitchen itself can work if the regulations at that time allow it, and they will just use a delivery app and deliver to their customers. The issue with delivery apps is that they take a cut from both, from mostly from the restaurant itself and sometimes from the consumer, but mostly from the restaurants itself. So what happened is that and this was especially an issue for small restaurants, is that if they say we're manufacturing something like a meal for £10 and they were selling it for £20, then they are making 10 as profit, £10. And that £10 is not necessarily pure profit, because they have to pay for the rent of the place being open, they have to pay salary, they have to pay maybe taxes, whatever. And so in the end, they end up with £5 as profit. And they were fine before the pandemic with that. Like, that was a level of profit for them that is good. Everyone is happy. The restaurant owner is happy. Employees are being offered a good salary. The food is not very expensive. People buy it, and so on. But when you introduce a delivery app, what happens is that this five that they were making as net profit, they now have to pay delivery apps something out of it. So they have to pay maybe £2.50, or sometimes even the full £5 as fees to these delivery apps. And take into consideration that also during the pandemic, they also needed to buy things for their staff like hand sanitizer and masks and so on. And so these are also increased expenses. And so what happened is that it became that every penny that they make from selling food through these delivery apps is sort of going out in expenses. And for even smaller companies, they found themselves that not just this net profit is going out also as expenses to these delivery apps, but they also have to take out from their savings. And so it became, for a lot of businesses, unsustainable to have these delivery apps. And so a lot of businesses are closing again and not using these delivery apps, because it's not worth it to be open if what I'm going to make as profit is 0 or 2.5 pounds instead of the 5 that I used to generally make. What some restaurants did at the start of the pandemic, I tried to find pictures of that, but I couldn't, was that some restaurants started to sell the ingredients. So you will get a bag of, for example, the burgers, the bun, the extra special secret sauce, the whatever, and you would cook them at home and assemble them yourself. And this was something that people were happy, people who were concerned with cleanliness especially were happy about that, because then it's cleaner. But then that also had issues with how do we deliver these packages to people. So do we use a delivery app or a pickup location or something? So I think I saw these at the start of the pandemic, but they sort of disappeared, maybe because of all of these issues. And also, as a consumer, if I'm buying fast food or ready food, I don't want to cook it. I just want the food. But I understand, of course, cleanliness was issued also for me as well. So maybe that strategy did not survive. Maybe it didn't prove to be very good. But then something that I see a lot is that some restaurants started to sell ready food at supermarkets. And so they removed the delivery apps. They just delivered themselves every morning to the supermarket like this. So Pancho Villa is a very popular, a very big restaurant chain, at least in Finland. I'm not sure if it's globally recognized, but at least in Finland. And so they would make ready meals like this that would be sold in the local supermarket chains. So for example, like Carrefour in Egypt and stuff like that. And so they just make one delivery in the morning and that's it. So that's sort of a way that restaurants have developed to bypass these delivery apps while recognizing that still consumers would not go to the restaurant itself, maybe because they're afraid to sit at the restaurant or something like that. If we continue with, I think this might be the last example that we have of the tech industries, this is sort of where things were completely different. Rather than a lack of demand, they had excessive demand. Like we have all seen the jokes on Facebook that Zoom is the biggest beneficiary from the pandemic. So they had excessive demand. But that in itself is not necessarily good, because what we have seen, especially with Zoom, is that there were a lot of cyber attacks. So someone would jump in during a call, and they would show inappropriate content that is psychologically traumatizing. So it's not just that it's inappropriate, it's also like it creates an injury, a psychological injury in people. And that was a big issue when we are using Zoom to teach young children. And so at the same time, Zoom was not able to respond very quickly to introduce better security settings and stuff like that. So this sudden boost and increase in demand is also not very good for most businesses, because they cannot cope. We've seen service overloads. We've seen that the internet globally, and I've heard from my parents, especially in Egypt, has been overloaded. And companies like Netflix, so that's a streaming company that basically lives online, they have had to ask their users to lower the quality of their streaming so that Netflix can continue to stream to a lot of people. So it's sort of like a business that is divided between that I cannot sustain this, I cannot stream to all of these people at the same time, but at the same time I cannot tell people not to give me money. And so that's a very weird balance that these companies found themselves in, and they had to respond quickly. Like these industries have been hiring, and that has been also a challenge, because how do you interview people? Where do they work? You can't provide training for people that you hire now, because there isn't offices, there isn't the ability to train. And so they somehow often relied on employees that they already have and asked them to work overtime. And while that might sound good, it was not exactly good, because these employees eventually burn out. And so we've seen that a lot of people are starting to drop out because of mental illnesses. Um, and at the same time, they were not able to work overtime sometimes because they also have kids at home that they need to teach and stuff like that. So the tech industries, while they seem to be flourishing and doing well, there is a lot of micro impact on its employees and individuals that might carry for the coming years. But in terms of complaining, at least these industries are sort of doing well. And we're sort of expecting that over time, people that were sort of laid off, sorry, from hotels and so on, that maybe these people eventually will shift to these industries. That is, of course, if they have the same skill or anything. But one prediction is that we somehow are seeing sort of a redistribution of labor from some industries that are not maybe sustainable at this time to other industries where there is huge demand and huge need. And this has also affected not the software industry, but also there was a global, and there is still, I think, a global shortage when it comes to hardware. So there was a global shortage in laptops because so you would expect in a family that maybe the parents would have each a laptop, for example, or a computer. But kids did not have laptops. And suddenly every kid in the world needed a computer to access the internet. And they cannot exactly use their parents because their parents also need the computer to work. And so suddenly we needed an influx of computers to be produced. But at the same time, factories cannot cope because they cannot hire people because social distancing, and often there might be outbreaks and then the factory would need to close for a few weeks and stuff like that. And so excessive demand does not necessarily mean that these industries were doing well. The issues just appear differently than they appear in the industries where we've seen a sudden drop in demand. And what this has meant is that there is divides between people are getting bigger. So you see that for some people, they have a laptop. Some families already had a happy situation where each kid in the family had a laptop or a tablet or whatever. But with other families, they did not have that, either because maybe one family was rich and the other was poor, or because one family was more conscious about maybe kids' time online than the other, or whatever the reason is. It remains a fact that we have some kids who have a laptop to access their internet and their school, while others now don't. And this divide has always existed in society. Like either it's because of, like I said, rich and poor, or just simply because of differences in people. Like I know people, grown-ups, as old as I am, and they didn't have a laptop at home or a computer at home because they don't want to take their work home. So they just have their work computer at the office and then their mobile phone at home, because they want this separation. And then even these people suddenly either needed permission to move their laptops or their work computers from the office to home, and not all companies were ready to do that. And so they sometimes had to buy these on their own, and this shortage and extra expensive and all that stuff that I've been talking about. So the conclusion, whatever the reason is that now we have this divide between people, where some people are doing well and they're able to access the internet and to live online, and their life is not as hugely affected by, but for others, they're getting more and more isolated and they're getting more and more left behind. And so this did not come because of the pandemic, but sort of the pandemic highlighted this divide between us, in terms of between people, in terms of the things, the opportunities they have, and so on. And it's important to remember that even diseases and natural disasters and stuff like that, they don't affect people equally because we do not treat people equally. And what I mean by that is that for example, rich people have access to better healthcare services. That is sort of a fact of life. And poorer people do not have the same access. And so if you imagine two people getting sick, it's with the COVID or whatever, it's very likely that the services they would have access to will be different. And so it's possible that the rich person will get well sooner and will develop less complication, while the poor person will develop more complications or might even die. And so they will carry the weight of the pandemic more and the weight of the disease more because of existing inequalities. So because we already did not treat people equally in our society, we have people suffering differently now. So when you even think about social distancing, like how would you ask a family of where it's five people living in one room to social distance? To social distance themselves from each other, like that is not like, how do you, like, even the luxury of social distancing is a luxury. To be able to have a room in your house where you can work is a luxury. Like how would that work when you have five people in a room, or when you're living in a noisy neighborhood, or and so on. And so even the ability to social distance in itself is a luxury. And because of that, we have people affected differently by the pandemic, and we have people who were especially disadvantaged getting more and more disadvantaged. And this is something that we sort of need to respond to in the coming years. Like we need to make a conscious decision if we want to fix and undo that, or if we don't want to do that. And the same goes for businesses. So smaller businesses were affected more than bigger businesses. Smaller businesses did not have as much saving, are not as recognized to consumers as big businesses. They were not able to as quickly change their strategies. Like McDonald's in Finland can very easily sign up with Wolt or whatever delivery app and deliver food to its customers, and it will not suffer as much because already its net profit was big, like its margins were already big. But if a local restaurant sign up with a delivery app, like they can't, their margin is too small, that the delivery app already ate all of their profit. And so small businesses cannot respond as efficiently as big businesses on so many levels. And so the flip side of that is that, or maybe the unexpected side of that, is that this virtual living has somehow created more opportunities for a few people with disabilities. Like think about someone who was using a wheelchair, having to go to school or to university every day, and now they can consume lectures online. They are not exactly happy about the pandemic because they also have to social distance, and they are also probably at risk, so they are more worried about their health. But in terms of access to education, I wouldn't also say they have better access to education, because I don't think in many cases Zoom lectures and all that stuff is not better at all. But they sort of are more equal to everyone now in terms of attending or the ability to attend a lecture. Some of the stories that I've heard online were that people on wheelchairs, especially, like there was one story I read on Facebook that she has always wanted to learn, I think it was the piano, but classes were very far from where she lived, and she needed someone to help her, and it was a huge hassle. And so she never learned the piano. But with the pandemic and everything being online, she just now has an online tutor. And this was something that we could have done in our society long time ago. Like we have had this technology, Zoom technology, and lecture recordings for a very long time ago, but we were not very conscious about integration of people and providing such services to people. But now we sort of accidentally came to provide them. And so what I want to highlight from this is that as we move forward, we sort of need to realize that this was a bad time. Yes, it was. It affected a lot of people negatively. It created a bigger divide. And there are things that we need to be conscious that happened and change them back to better. But we also need to recognize some of the positives maybe that took place and to somehow keep them if we want to sort of provide equity for everyone. And the next challenge, like where this will come to surface, this idea will come to surface, is with the manufacturing of the vaccine, because we now have the option, or we can see whether medical companies are going to unite and maybe help each other with the production of the vaccine, or if we will see increased competition and business competition, especially to make more profits and so on. The transportation of the vaccine also is going to be an issue, because we might need to draft it. It needs to be, a lot of the vaccines need to be refrigerated at very low temperatures, and so this might be a time where we would need to ask cargo companies that sort of transport, fish and meat and any kind of cold product. We might need to draft their services. And so we sort of now are at a crossroads where will humanity cooperate together and put together and sort of let go of immediate profit and immediate self-interest for the greater good and for future self-interest as well? Or will we just act individually and individualistically as we sometimes see? And this doesn't just apply to businesses, this applies to consumers, this applies to, I think, all society as we go forward from this point on. And I had more that I wanted to talk about. I think that I probably covered it. Basically, it's that we don't know what's going to happen in terms of specific consumer habits. Like, we know that this is not sustainable, that this level of online shopping is not sustainable, this number of packages, we cannot manage it. But then it remains what will change. So are consumers going to change back and stop or lower their online shopping and go back to shopping from regular shops and so on? Or is it that businesses are going to have to somehow learn to cope and to produce more and to improve our delivery infrastructure and stuff like that? So we don't know. We're sort of at a crossroads in everything. Are we going to learn from this and invest more in health in general, and especially in mental health, or not? Because we also have the challenge that levels of depression and anxiety and a lot of mental health issues are increasing nowadays. So will we fix somehow that and increase our investment in mental health in the coming months to compensate for what happened? Or are we going to leave things as we are? And if we leave things as we are, then they cannot be left as we are, basically, because we cannot take it. Like, as humans, we cannot work if we're that depressed and anxious. As businesses, we cannot work if this is the increased demand that we have and we are unable to cope with it. As businesses also, we cannot work if consumers do not choose to support us and to buy locally. And so the sort of the coming time is sort of unclear, and we are at a cross path, and we have to remember that even us as a small individuals, or as small consumers, that every time we spend our money, we're choosing something. If you don't like how Amazon, for example, has treated some of its workers during the pandemic, then choose not to buy from Amazon and buy from something else. If you like how Souq.com has made your life easy, then keep buying from Souq.com. If you want investments in mental health, then you invest as well in mental health and maybe support your local therapist and stuff like that. So remember that you have power. Like, all of this lecture, the point of it is to show that consumers do have power, and that businesses sort of have to change in order to cope with that power. You cannot just keep making stuff and selling it, because it's not always that people are going to buy it and come for it. And so in a lot of cases, we need to somehow revise our not just business strategy as companies, but also our personal strategies and the choices that we make and what we vote for with our money. And I think I am definitely more than the time that I was asked to keep by a lot. So I am sorry about that. Um, but I hope that you have taken something out of this lecture. I hope that it was informative, and I personally sincerely enjoyed preparing it, and it was also interesting to think about um, how reflect on these past months and sort of from where we were when the pandemic first started, when it was declared as a pandemic or as a global health emergency, to where we are now, when we're sort of trying to make sense of what is happening and how the future is going to be. I enjoyed preparing the lecture. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. And like I said, I look forward to any questions that you might have or any comments. It would be really interesting to compare what you've thought about the pandemic. But, you know, I'm just going to wait for this virtually in the coming days. So thank you, and take care of yourself and be healthy.